All right, Alexander, let's talk about Boris Johnson, and then let's also do an update as to what's going on in France with Macron. So we have big news out of the UK. What is going on with Boris Johnson?
Right. Well, what's happening is that I think he's now really on. I mean, we've said this many times that he's in a weak position, but I think today we are at what is undoubtedly, I think, now the end game. What happened is that yesterday there were two parliamentary by-elections. Parliamentary by-elections happen when an MP either dies or retires or moves on, and there's no MP, and you have to have an election whilst the Parliament is still sitting to fill the vacancy. So there were two parliamentary by-elections. One was in Wakefield, which is a sort of northern working class constituency, one of those constituencies which traditionally supported the Labour Party, but which in 2019, over the Brexit issue, switched to the Conservatives, giving the Conservatives that big majority that they won in 2019 in the general election that happened then. And the second election was in a place called Tiverton and Horton, which is a southern, affluent, middle class seat, the kind of seat which the Conservatives have always held, an archetypical Conservative seat. And the Conservative majority there was huge. I mean, it was 24,000, which in a seat of this kind, represents, I mean, I don't know, something like 50, 60% of the total vote. Anyway, there were two by-elections, one in a working class seat, one in a middle class seat, if you like. Labour were the main challenger in Wakefield. The Liberal Democrats were the main challenger in Tiverton and Horton. And what happened was the Conservatives lost both. Now, they lost Wakefield. There was a big swing to Labour, but not huge. And they were widely expected to lose Wakefield. But Tiverton, the swing has been the biggest in British history. The Conservative majority, which was 24,000, was converted into a Liberal majority of around 22,000. It is, I think, a 30% swing. It's the biggest swing from one party to another in a parliamentary by-election, certainly since the 1930s. It shows that in this part of the UK, the Conservatives' own heartland, the people are just having enough, and they're saying, we can't take this anymore. We're going to leave the Conservative Party. The Liberal Democrats were the main opposition, so we may not think very much of them, but we're going to overwhelmingly support them. Now, in the hours afterwards, the chairman of the Conservative Party, who's a supporter of Johnson, resigned, and I think it's only a matter of time now before criticism within the Conservative Party mounts to the point where Johnson himself is forced to resign too. I mean, I think his position after these results, these election results, is untenable. The Wakefield result, as it was expected, it was not huge. It was a 12% swing. Little enthusiasm for Keir Starmer anywhere in Britain. That's the Labour leader. But the other election in Tiverton and Horton was a disaster, a catastrophe for the Conservatives, and it's the catastrophe for Boris Johnson. Now, can I say it's unsurprising? Just to remind our viewers, I think I mentioned this before. I sent you a photograph about a couple of days ago, how in an affluent area of London, in North London, where I live, there was a long queue outside a food bank. You could see it on the street, stretching far up the street, because people are having to go to food banks to get food. Prices are rising, mortgage costs are rising, The economy is under enormous pressure. Living standards are collapsing at a rate faster and greater than anyone we've ever seen since modern records began. We have strikes on the railways. We have strikes pending in the airlines. Teachers are threatening to go on strike. There's strikes right across the economy. Even lawyers are striking. There is a massive sense across Britain that the wheels are coming off, that the economy is breaking down. Inevitably, people are turning on Boris Johnson and they're saying, you know, this person, he's not governing us anymore. He's not really interested in us any longer. He prefers, whenever things become difficult, to go to Kiev and meet with Zelensky instead. And what you said on that program, which we did a couple of days ago, about how Johnson hides in Kiev when he has problems in England, in Britain, all the media is now saying it. You are the first person I know to actually say it. But now it's become something that the whole of the media in Britain is saying.
Okay, so before we move on to Macron, how does it work? Does Boris resign? Do the party leaders, like, do they go make like a formal request? Do they have a vote? How does this process work? Or how
Well,
may
theory,
potentially work?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In theory, there can't be another leadership challenge for a year because Boris survived the last one. But in practice, I think what will happen is that sooner or later somebody in the cabinet will screw up their courage, talk to the other members of the cabinet, and they'll all come and they'll tell Johnson, look, this is impossible. You can't continue. You've got to resign, because if you don't resign, we're resigning instead. And if Johnson starts to lose cabinet ministers, then the whole government threatens collapse. And at that point, he can't govern anymore. And then he's going to be forced to resign. Remember, if he tries to cling on, the Conservative Party can change its own rules. So he doesn't, I think, want to be put in that position. So I think this is probably not going to take very long now. I think within the next few weeks, perhaps days even, we will be seeing the back of Boris Johnson. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how it will be done, but the Conservative Party is notoriously unsentimental towards leaders who fail, and Johnson is visibly failing. In fact, he's visibly failed. I have to quickly say that, of course, no one in the political class, no one in the Conservative Party, no one in the Labour Party, no one in the Liberal Democrat Party, no one in any party in Britain has a solution to this problem. No one is coming forward and saying, this is how we're going to turn the problems round. This is how we're going to start bringing prices under control, how we're going to bring the economy back to some kind of stability. No one is doing that because, of course, the one thing you have to do in order to stabilize the situation is reverse course on Ukraine. And the entire political class have become utterly compromised on this because they've all backed the war in Ukraine. So it's going to be very difficult for them to turn around and do this. But sooner or later, it will have to be done.
Yeah, I mean, Orban has pretty much said as much. You want to fix the economy in the EU, in your country, then drop the sanctions, turn back the sanctions, and start negotiating with Russia. But that was going to be my final question with regard to the UK, is that even if Boris leaves, nothing is going to really change. I mean, no money. I've read the UK has no weapons anymore. They've almost been demilitarized by Russia. And that's not coming from me. That's actually coming from senior military officials who testified before the parliament. Strikes, shortages, rising fuel costs. I mean, even if they're dead set on going to war with Russia, how can they proceed when your country's in shambles like this? I mean, even if they get someone to replace Boris Johnson and he's just as much of a war hawk, or he's just as compromised by the globalists, how can they possibly continue to go down this route when they just don't have any resources left to continue this?
You're absolutely right. Well, they can't, despite which it shows how completely out of touch with reality are. That, I actually read yesterday. I think I mentioned it to you. I read an article in the Telegraph by Con Coughlin, who is a journalist here, very, very, very neocon oriented journalist, and he said Britain must prepare for war with Russia. You said to yourself, what planet are these people on? I mean, war with Russia? Britain? I mean, is this, suicide that you're leading us to? But there are people who still talk in this way. I have to say, at some point, something has to give. It can't go on like this indefinitely. But I also say, and I've said it before in many programs, I've never known it to be so bad. Because on the one hand, we have an economic crisis, which, to be frank, is worse than the one we had in the 1970s. People make that comparison. This one is much worse. But at the same time, we have a political class which is in total denial, and all of whose members, collectively, the Liberals, the Labour Party, the Conservatives, look completely incompetent and entirely out of their depth. I don't know how we're going to get out of this one, but the sense of collapse is pervasive. You're absolutely right. We've given away most of our weapons. We haven't given away our ships or our planes and our tanks, but all our light weapons, much of our artillery, all those our ammunition, all those sort of things. And the other thing is, and I don't think this has been picked up widely, but you're hearing that a lot of British military people, there's been apparently studies, are coming back and are saying British weapons didn't work very well in Ukraine, either because there's problems with the weapons themselves or because the Ukrainians weren't trained to use them properly. There wasn't time. So, it's been a debacle from almost every side. And yet, I was reading today in The Guardian, long piece by a man called Patrick Wintour, who says we must increase the number of weapons we send to Ukraine. Ukraine isn't getting weapons fast enough, apparently. We've got to send even more and more quickly. Don't worry about things like training, logistics, supplies of ammunition. All you've got to do is just go on giving them weapons until we've got none and they've still collapsed, and that's what we must do. That's our moral duty, apparently. So when you have that kind of mindset in Britain, it's very, very difficult to believe that things are going to be turned around anytime soon.
Yeah. All right. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about France and the fact that Macron is not doing much better than Boris Johnson. I mean, he's marginally better, but at least he'll stay in office, it seems. But it'll be a very, very much weakened second term for Macron. That's how it's looking.
Well, indeed, absolutely. Now, of course, we did a program about the parliamentary elections in France a short time ago. The very interesting thing was that after the result came in, Macron disappeared. We talk about Boris Johnson hiding in Kiev. Macron also went into hiding. Hours passed, days passed, and there was no sight of him. He didn't come out. He didn't address the French people. He didn't, give some great statements. He didn't, as Jupiter. Remember all of that? Napoleon. He was at an absolutely loss what to do. He was clearly shocked and stunned that the result should have turned out the way that it did. Anyway, he's now talking about creating a government of national unity. But a government of national unity with whom? The left, led by Mélenchon, want to have nothing to do with him. Le Pen, of course, on the right. And can I just explain, by the way, that the leader of the opposition in the French parliament is actually Marine Le Pen. Because even though Mélenchon's grouping is the biggest grouping, it consists of many parties, a whole group of cluster of different parties. So the biggest single party in the French parliament is actually Marine Le Pen's. It's the National Rally. Macron's grouping is a coalition of groups. Mélenchon's grouping is a coalition of groups. The single biggest standalone group is the one led by Marine Le Pen. Well, she obviously is not entering into any kind of coalition with Macron. And as for the Republicans, the old classical conservative party, the party that claims, falsely by the way, to be, the inheritors of de Gaulle's mantle, why would they want to get into a coalition with Macron? Because they must sense that doing so is electoral poison for them. So at the moment, they're keeping a distance as well. And can I just say, in France, the economic crisis hasn't really hit home to the extent that it has in Britain. And there's many debates as to quite why that is, but it's going to get a lot worse from this point on, because now gradually all the problems are starting to mount. And on top of that, you were talking about how the British military are unhappy with the debacle in Ukraine. There's increasing word that the French military are equally unhappy. Now, they were strong-armed into sending to Ukraine 12 Caesar self-propelled howitzer guns. They apparently said to Macron, this is an incredibly bad idea. We don't have that many of them to start with. Sending them to Ukraine guarantees that the Russians will capture some of them. And 12 howitzers realistically isn't going to make any difference in a battle zone like that of Ukraine. Well, Macron just overruled them and insisted that these howitzers had to be sent. And within days of them being sent, 2 of them were captured by the Russians and are now being taken apart by the Russians. And, of course, the Russians are finding out all about it. Anyway, the French military apparently are furious. It's leaking out now in the independent media in France, which does exist. France has a bigger alternative media than Britain does, by the way. Anyway, it's leaking out there that the French military are incredibly angry. There's enormous recriminations about this between the military and the politicians. And we'll see how all of this pans out. But the whole situation in France, it's exactly what you said, a lame duck president who doesn't know what to do, a parliament that is in open revolt against him, an angry and sullen population, a military that's becoming increasingly critical, and an economic crisis that is only just beginning. And what we're seeing in France is reproducing itself everywhere. We had local elections in Italy a short time ago. The brothers did extremely well. It looks increasingly as if they have the momentum now. And of course, there's elections, national elections due in Italy next year. And it looks as if the brothers might actually emerge as the biggest party and form the next coalition. We've had elections in Spain, local elections in Spain, in Andalusia. The Spanish Socialist Party saw its vote collapse. Andalusia is its heartland, and I gather its vote fell to 20%. I mean, it just collapsed basically like, a souffle. It was just an implosion. And in Germany, they're running out of gas, and Robert Habeck, the economics minister, is now introducing rationing. And we're in June. We're not even reached winter yet. So, I mean, the wheels are coming off everywhere. Perhaps in Britain, the political crisis has caught up with the economic crisis. But nowhere in Europe do you have leaders, except, of course, in Hungary and a few places like that, but nowhere in any of the big countries in Europe, do you have leaders who are prepared to come out and say, enough, stop, this has to end, we have to turn it round, we have to end this economic war. It's destroying the economic fabric of Europe. It's bringing us to one disaster after another. Instead, we get token gestures like decisions to grant Ukraine candidate status of the EU, as we discussed in another video.
Yeah, Ireland is also talking about rationing energy as well, fuel, which is incredible. Record coal imports from South Africa, Europe. Europe is importing record amounts of coal from South Africa. But don't worry, the coal from South Africa, Alexander, is environmentally friendly, according to Ursula von der Leyen.
Absolutely. I mean,
You're
we're not dirty Russian coal. It's
exactly,
ethical and clean
exactly.
South African
green,
coal.
environmentally safe. Which is just really bizarre, given the fact that Ursula and Habeck and Brabach are so ideologically driven by the green agenda. It just seems to me that just to close out the video, that Europe is just, and I say the UK when I mean Europe, it's just a ship that is adrift on the ocean. It's just crashing into the rocks known as Ukraine.
Well, absolutely. You're absolutely
we've said
right.
it. Is this the hill? Is this the hill that you wanna have your last stand on? It looks like perhaps it is.
Well, indeed. Well, can I just remind our viewers, and indeed us, that you said some time ago, pretty early on, that it was absolute folly for NATO to invest all its prestige on Ukraine. Well, it's folly for NATO, and it was lunacy for the EU. But that's what they did. They didn't think it through. Remember that article we discussed by Wolfgang Munchau? We didn't think it through. Well, they obviously didn't think it through. And, well, we see the price. But, all these people who didn't think it through, they're still there, and, they're not reversing course. They don't know how. That's the trouble.
Yeah. Just to close it out, it seems like the people are kind of getting there. I mean, you're starting to see protests. Yeah. I think you had 80,000 protesters in Belgium the other day, and there were protests actually in the UK and in Ireland as well, if I'm not mistaken. So the protests are starting, but it seems like we're still at the very beginning. And given that it's summer and a lot of people are kind of, a little bit of a summer haze, and they're going to be holidaying, I just don't see everything really hitting a critical stage until after the summer is over on all fronts, including people's outrage.
Well, that's exactly what will happen is people go on their holidays and then they'll come back in September, and that's probably when things are really going to start getting wild, both in economic terms and, of course, in terms of, political protest. I just wanted to add one thing, which is I feel particularly bitter about Britain, because the whole point about Brexit was to get away from this morass of stupidity in Europe. And having achieved Brexit, what do we go and do? The first opportunity, we go and rejoin it, because that's what we've done. We've acted in lockstep with the EU. In fact, we encouraged the EU to go down this route of disaster, and we joined them in it. And this has been the most shameful act of folly and act of betrayal I can ever think of. I mean, Boris Johnson really deserves everything he's going to get, and he deserves a lot more than what he's going to get as well, because he had this huge opportunity handed to him by the British people, who'd made their feelings and wishes completely clear, and he's thrown it away. I think he's the most disastrous Prime Minister in my lifetime, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah, he wrecked everything. And one final note, as we enter winter, come September, October, we talk about how things are going to deteriorate for Europe. Things are going to get a lot worse. The winter begins to favor the Russians as well. So all trends are looking terrible for Europe, and they're looking good for Russia. And when I mean it's going to favor the Russians, it's going to favor them on an economic level and with the war on Ukraine. As we enter winter, everything tilts even more towards Russia's favor.
Absolutely. I mean, what do they say? That the Russians have an invincible general in their army that they can always call out in case of need, General Winter. And he's not yet even got on his horse yet, but he will before long. So there we are.
All right.
You're absolutely right.
Leave it there. Yeah. The Duran.locals.com and the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code Good Day. Take care.